I am delighted to welcome Elizabeth Francis and Colin Woodard to URI, where we occupy the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. Many thanks to everyone who braved this unpleasant weather to turn out today, and I know a lot of people are live streaming instead back in their warm, cozy living rooms or offices, so welcome to all the live streamers too. And I'd now like to introduce Jen Riley, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at URI, who will say a few words.
Thank you, Eve, and welcome everyone. Welcome to our online people. It's great that you're out there and that we have the streaming capacity to reach to you. Colin, I'm going to be a little bit about Elizabeth because for transparency's sake, I'm a board member of the Rhode Island Humanities Council and have been for several years. And what brought me to work with the council was, Elizabeth knows the story. I talk about, she and I were walking through India Point one day in Providence, and she was telling me about the Civic Health Initiative. And I thought, this is what we need, right? This is a really smart thing for Rhode Island. And it really drew me to what Rhode Island Humanities was doing, because the need to understand civic health is more essential than ever if we're going to have strong, resilient, collaborative communities and ensure the sustenance of our democracy. And also because the value that the humanities bring to us for problem solving, for building connections across differences, fostering curiosity, imagination, and empathy, I think are more needed than ever today. And that's something that we try and teach our students here as well, bringing the humanities into their life. Elizabeth Francis' leadership of this initiative, along with Julia Renaud, I'm sorry she couldn't be here, and the rest of the Rhode Island Humanities team, has provided a valuable analysis of Rhode Island that has led to public humanities programming and conversations across the state. I was not surprised when the Rhode Island Civic Health Index was recognized by the Federation of State Humanities Councils with the 2023 Schwartz Prize for outstanding work in the public humanities. And I think when you hear this conversation, you'll hear why that happened. I also just want to give a shout out to some of our faculty, because I'm pleased that Julie Keller, Associate Professor of Sociology and Director of our Social Science Institute for Research, Education, and Policy, our own Eve Stern for our Center for Humanities and Associate Professor of History, Yin-Jiao Yi, Professor in Communication Studies, and Renee Hobbs, a Professor in Communication Studies, and the Director of our Media Education Lab, participated in this initiative. And I think it shows the importance of collaborations between the University of Rhode Island, the state's flagship institution, and the organizations in our communities that are doing the work that makes stronger communities. And it's a partnership that we really value. So I thank Elizabeth for that. I also thank Colin for being here, Director of the Nationhood Lab at Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy at Salve. I was telling Colin that I spent part of today reading about what you do. It's fantastic, looking at these big pictures, such as who are we as a nation? Questions I think we need to be asking and engaging people in. And it's work that I'd like to bring us together more across Salve and URI as well. So thank you for being here today. I think this session is actually really fitting end to what's been a fantastic semester of events on sustaining democracy, led by Eve and her team from our Center for Humanities.
Thanks so much, Jen. Appreciate that. So I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our speakers this evening. Elizabeth Francis is Executive Director of Rhode Island Humanities, the State Humanities Council. In this position, she leads the Council's promotion of public history, cultural heritage, civic education, and community engagement. Elizabeth has expertise in building partnerships and initiatives that bring together humanities scholars, community members, public humanities practitioners, and policymakers in economic and cultural development. Deeply interested in the connection between public participation and cultural activities and overall civic health, Elizabeth recently co-authored with Julia Renaud, as Jen Riley mentioned, Culture is Key, Strengthening Rhode Island's Civic Health Through Cultural Participation, which led to the development of the state's first ever Civic Health Index in 2022. And this afternoon, Elizabeth will be telling us more about this really important and innovative project. Colin Woodard is Director of the Nationhood Lab at the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy at Salve Regina University. He is the New York Times best-selling author of 6 books, as well as a longtime foreign correspondent who reported for more than 50 countries and 7 continents and was a finalist for a 2016 Pulitzer Prize. This afternoon, Colin will discuss the Nationhood Lab, an interdisciplinary research, writing, testing, and dissemination project focused on counteracting the authoritarian threat to American democracy and the centrifugal forces threatening the nation's stability. This project delivers more effective tools with which to describe and defend the American liberal tradition and better understand the forces undermining it. This fall, they completed an in-depth message development and testing initiative to create an effective, compelling messaging strategy for a U.S. civic national narrative that is meant to outcompete the ethno-national authoritarian MAGA alternative. Our third panelist, Julia Renaud of Rhode Island Humanities, is unfortunately unable to join us because of illness, but we're so sorry she can't be part of this important conversation, but I know she's watching the live stream, so thank you, Julia. And finally, I just want to say a few words about the format of today's presentation. Elizabeth and then Colin will make a presentation. Then I'll lead a short moderated conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And so people on the live stream, please type any questions you have into the chat, and we will be monitoring that. So now I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Francis.
So thank you, Professor Stern. It is great to be part of the Sustaining Democracy series at the Center for the Humanities at the University of Rhode Island. And I'm very pleased that you were able to include the Civic Health Index and Rhode Island Humanities. And I just want to mention again that Julia Renaud, the co-author of the Civic Health Index that we're going to be talking about a little bit today, and who is also our Associate Director of Grants and Strategic Initiatives, was also going to be here, but is feeling under the weather. But I want to underscore that everything I am saying is indebted to the wonderful work that Julia accomplished as co-author of the Civic Health Index. And for that, and also so many other things, her thought partnership has been so valuable to me. So I wanted to begin, since this is about sustaining democracy, and at the Humanities Center, I wanted to start with one of the famous phrases from the 1965 legislation that founded the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities in 1965. And that phrase is, "Democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens." And I want to complete the paragraph because I think it's also very relevant, and I think you'll immediately see its relevance. So, democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizen, this legislation says. It must therefore foster and support a form of education and access to the arts and the humanities designed to make people of all backgrounds and wherever located, masters of their technology and not its unthinking servants. And I've put up the web address for that founding legislation. It's really well worth reading the legislation in full, and so I encourage you to do that. But just to gloss this phrase, "democracy demands wisdom and vision," a bit, It has become the touchstone for the NEH nationally, and its priority on reaching every American, not just the few, was also the basis for establishing the nationwide network of humanities councils as independent nonprofits affiliates of NEH, a little bit after NEH was founded in the early 1970s. But this phrase says boldly and directly that the humanities are necessary to sustain and fulfill the promises of democracy, and that this is a question of citizen knowledge, consciousness, expression, and participation. But the question that I think really has hovered over a lot of the work of humanities councils is the question of how does this happen? And how do we know that it is happening or not? So what's the evidence? How do we know that humanities and communities has this impact on democracy? And then further, what room does that phrase make for the limitations, failures, and contradictions of democracy, as well as the possible alternatives that are nevertheless articulated through wisdom and vision of its citizens? So that, so those questions take us to the framework for civic health, or at least those questions are what propelled us toward the framework of civic health here in Rhode Island. So in 2022, we developed in partnership with the National Conference on Citizenship and the Rhode Island Department of State, Rhode Island's first ever Civic Health Index. We did this in response to an NEH initiative to begin the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which is coming up in 2026. So our question was, what better way to commemorate this complex moment for American democracy than to hold up a mirror showing this complex moment that we are in now? We were the only humanities council to take this approach to this initiative from NEH that was called A More Perfect Union. And we were the first humanities council to lead the development of a civic health index. So while the connection between the humanities and democracy was implicitly part of this project, we were drawn to the framework of civic health rather than democracy building. It seemed to be a more open-ended and flexible way of understanding the perspectives and experiences of community members as critical to the formation and the fissures of democracy. The National Conference on Citizenship, which sponsors civic health indexes across the country, describes civic health as the strength and resiliency of communities and how communities are organized to define and address public problems. And so taking that idea of strength and resilience and how communities are organized to address public problems is fundamentally a question of well-being and of community participation. And just another kind of context note, participation in civic life has long been an essential and defining quality of American democracy. That is what Alexis de Tocqueville marveled at in his Democracy in America essays from the 1830s. And it was what Robert Putnam saw as dramatically declining in his influential 2000 book, Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community. Putnam argued that the decline in participation in civic life was a serious threat to sustaining democracy. And in our conversation following, we'll talk more about the connection between democracy and the humanities and civic health, but here I will quickly present the areas of participation in civic life that emerged as both qualitative and quantitative ways to characterize Rhode Island. Based on the analysis of extensive data and conversations with community members, Rhode Island Civic Health Index defined 5 areas of civic health. And I just want to underscore that we didn't impose those areas. These areas are what emerged from what we learned. So the 5 areas were community well-being, which include the material and social conditions of people's lives, like affordable housing, access to healthy food, access to health care, and other indicators of well-being. Another area was social connection. Strong connections between people in the places they live are fundamental to public safety, civic involvement, responsiveness to disasters and emergencies, and investment in community. And Rhode Island, I'm not going to talk a lot about the outcomes in this presentation, but I will note that Rhode Island is #1 in the country for social connection. So that's, something, I don't think anybody is surprised by that, but given the less than 1 degree of separation, but that is a point of pride, I think, for Rhode Island. Another area is public participation. This includes contributions of time and resources, both financial and non-financial, and participation in community groups and participation in non-governmental civic institutions, like your participation in as a coach on a Little League team or your parent-teacher organization, things like that. And then the 4th area, which is very relevant to the humanities, is collective understanding. How people understand civics, history, and media. How we also included how people perceive public history, including monuments and city squares and neighborhoods. And in terms of the outcomes of the Civic Health Index, what's represented in the Civic Health Index, civic education and media, access to media and media literacy were big factors. And then finally, engagement with government, which is what most people think about when they think about civic participation. But that recognizes that individual and collective engagement with government is the lifeblood of a functioning democracy. This area of the index looks at public trust in government and also formal and informal ways of engaging with government, from voting to attending a city council meeting, participating in a political protest, and going to a municipal library. With the exception of engagement with government, the index's areas focused on community well-being and community participation. And I think importantly, this leaves a lot of room for community self-definition, which in turn can inform approaches to sustaining democracy. Our process for creating the Civic Health Index was informed by wanting to work through partnerships and valuing the perspectives of community members. So since this is the Rhode Island Civic Health Index, we needed many diverse voices in the room from all over the state, shaping the content from day one. We wanted to come up with a more nuanced understanding of what we need to account for if we want to improve civic health and sustain democracy. And so the community partners were essential in this process because they challenged what they saw as the narrowness of the data from the census that comes from the national, that is processed by the National Conference on Citizenship, and saw so many other areas that could be addressed. And so the Civic Health Index that we created really reflects that widening and inclusivity. And then we also drew from many different, both existing and new data sources. A new data source was the Rhode Island Civic Health Index survey that we developed for this project, and as a result of the conversations with the community partners. The backbone of the data set, as I mentioned, was the census information provided by NCOC, and then we supplemented with data from the Department of State, and all these other sources that you see listed on this slide. And we were particularly lucky to be doing our survey at the same time as the survey on civic learning. And so we were able to exchange data before publication of both reports. The media literacy statewide survey that was developed by the Media Education Lab here at URI, that had just been completed the year before. So a lot of this data was very current and very relevant to bringing this all together for a civic health index. Our own survey that we developed with community partners, we circulated through SurveyMonkey, and it was open for about 2 weeks. And we had a goal of 500 participants, and we got 751 responses from all 39 cities and towns in Rhode Island. And I do want to note that it is not statistically representative of Rhode Islanders, so we can't generalize the responses to the whole state. But the survey was specifically a response to the limitations that the community partners saw in the census data, and that led to a more nuanced and wide-ranging and inclusive understanding of what civic health is and what can and should be measured. As Eve mentioned, I want to note that in terms of the public reception of the Civic Health Index, that it was awarded a national prize by our peers, so that it has significance in the community of humanities practitioners. So going back to that NEH praise. It's good to note this award because it recognizes that humanities-based methods, working in partnership, amplifying many diverse voices, and valuing community self-definition are an important lens through which to define and understand civic health, and to incorporate into data-driven and evidence-based analysis. And I would also stress that that's also vice versa, that humanities methods need evidence-based and data-driven approaches as well. We were also able to include specifically humanities content as part of civic health. Historical understanding and commemoration matter. So I think that this is a real opportunity going forward, especially as we approach 2026. Such an approach points the way to commemorating the 250th in a way that connects to and improves civic health and that recognizes different perspectives and experiences. So with that, I thank you for listening, and I also want to note that there are copies of the index at the back of the room, as well as cards that have a QR code that take you to the website for the index if you are interested. And there's also a few copies of The Culture is Key, Strengthening Rhode Island Civic Health Through Cultural Participation report, as well as an executive summary of the index. So thank you. Oh, sorry.
Well, thank you all for coming, and to the University of Rhode Island and the Humanities Center for having me. I really appreciate it, especially being a past student of the humanities and a product of a liberal arts education. I mean, my whole career came from, I was born in late 68, so if you do the math, my childhood was Cold War, and then as I was entering college, it was perestroika and glasnost, and so I gravitated towards Soviet and East European studies and history, ended up, again, if you do the math, my junior year abroad in Eastern Europe in 1989, and communism collapsed while I was there, and then I ended up spending most of my 20s and most of the 1990s in that region as a foreign correspondent, so I could stay and see what would happen. Did graduate work in the same fields, but then that was a world where You were seeing the collapse of state communism, people trying to recreate liberal democracies where none had existed since the 1930s, which had its own problems, or where liberal democracies had never been before, and then the efforts of demagogues and such to move in and tell big lies and use battles over historical memory and forgetting and nationhood and national stories and ethnic identity and tribal notions for their own power plays, leading us all the way to the rise of little fascist regimes and Orban's authoritarian regime in Hungary, and of course the Bosnian war and the genocide in the midst of that, all of which I covered in that period, and learned a great deal about how humans think and about how the power of all these issues is applied. It's things that required cultural geography and understanding of symbolism and psychology and the history training I had and international relations and sociology and anthropology, mixing it all together. And there's not enough people doing that. Everyone who's deriding the humanities. We live in an incredibly complex society where every knowledge is by necessity siloed into expertises. There aren't enough people trained to cross-pollinate the ideas so that they're shared and integrated. So raw humanities education. So thank you for having me. I wanted to, right now I run a Nationhood Lab at Selby Regina University, which you heard described. We write and try to solve for the problems of U.S. nationhood, which have great implications for the survival of our liberal democratic tradition. I wanted to share with you two things that we're trying to do. We work on a tactical and a strategic level, and I'm going to start with the tactical stuff we do, which is to provide data-driven analysis of various phenomena in American life with the essential recognition of this key fact about America, that the United States is not a nation-state at all, but rather we're a collection of stateless nations, you might consider them, each with their own intents and ideals and stories of national purpose. Let's advance with the arrows. These regional cultures, which don't respect state or international boundaries, have never been in agreement over the big key issues like what's the proper role of government, what's the proper relationship between church and state, or even the meaning of such key words in the American lexicon as freedom or liberty. These stateless nations, these regional cultures, go back to the beginning of European conquest and settlement of this continent, to the 17th and early 18th centuries. The original colonies were settled by people from distinct regions of the British Isles, and from France and the Netherlands and Spain, each with their own religious and political and ethnographic characteristics. Each was first colonized in a different time and under a different political model. Some of these regional cultures you see up here champion individualism. Others, utopian social reform. Some of them embraced an explicit Anglo-Protestant identity. Others, ethnic and religious pluralism. Some valued equality and democratic participation in politics, thus the things that Alexis de Tocqueville saw when he traveled in those regions. Others, deference to an aristocratic order modeled on the slave states of classical antiquity. The Puritan project in New England had very little in common with the neo-feudal aristocratic society of the Chesapeake country, or with the Dutch commercial colonies encompassing what's now Greater New York City, or New Spain's far-flung northern frontier, or the West Indies-style slave society transplanted into the lowlands of the Carolinas and the Deep South by English planters from that fully formed system in Barbados. For generations, these discrete Euro-American cultures developed in remarkable isolation from one another, consolidating their own cherished principles and fundamental values, and expanding across the eastern half of the continent in nearly exclusive settlement bands. They saw themselves as competitors, for land, for settlers, for capital, and even as enemies, taking opposing sides in the English Civil War of the 1640s, in the events of the Glorious Revolution of 1689, in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and of course, the U.S. Civil War. Here, by the way, is a map of the Spanish colonization of the Southwest. The areas shaded are the areas that were actually settled boots on the ground by them prior to the U.S. annexations. But the point I'm making is that there's never been one America, but rather several Americas. And today, there are 11. Now, to see their effect, You have to use county level data because, again, the settlement patterns didn't follow state lines. Now, there isn't time right now in this format to describe them all to you, but suffice to say that they've always been divided on the key issues with profound effects on American history and society, and yes, indeed, on American presidential politics. Again, you got to look at a county map, not a state map. This one is the 1916 presidential map. Woodrow Wilson versus Charles Hughes, when Republicans in red were the party of communitarian values, and the Democrats in blue were the party of individual liberty and racial apartheid. Notice that the communitarian regions, Yankeedom, founded by the early Puritans, New Netherland with its pluralistic ethos and necessity of urbanized cooperation, and the left coast, settled in part by New Englanders, aligning with the former, and individualistic Deep South, Greater Appalachia, and Far West with the latter. This is the 2008 map, Barack Obama versus John McCain. Same map pretty much, except the colors have reversed, because by this time the parties had reversed polarity, platforms, ideologies, and regional constituencies. And you'll notice that the Deep South zone and Tidewater are no longer a monochrome of a single color, and you can see the El Norte region popping up against the backdrop of the Far West. That's because Latinos and African Americans were now able to vote, and they hadn't been able to in 1916. And yes, the same overall pattern holds today. These are the results of the 3 Trump elections. In all of them, the same coalition of regional cultures that backed Lincoln in 1860, Hughes in 1916, Obama in 2008 and 2012 opposed Trump, while the cultures that backed the Democrats in the 1860s and 1910s and the Republicans after the Civil Rights era backed Donald Trump. But the regional divide goes way beyond politics and its implications. It, for instance, affected the response to a deadly airborne virus. You can see how the individual liberty nations, South and Interior West again, hobbled the U.S. response to the COVID-19 pandemic, resisting mask wearing and vaccines. And you can see the vaccination rates here, mapped by Nationhood Lab by Nation, as of August 15th, 2021. Why? Because that was a time when vaccines had been freely available and accessible for a long period of time. If you weren't vaccinated by then, you didn't want to be. Some of the communitarian nations at that time had almost double the per capita vaccination rate of the Deep South. And these, relatedly, are the per capita COVID-19 deaths for the summer that followed from the New York Times. Now you can see these regional divides in the prevalence of all kinds of diseases, not just COVID. Here, for instance, is diabetes prevalence. Red is bad, blue is good. From CDC data is processed by my team of academic collaborators at the Universities of Minnesota and Illinois Chicago. As you can see, the Deep South and Greater Appalachia have a problem here. This is obesity. These maps, by the way, all generated at Nationhood Lab. This is life expectancy. As my project revealed in a Politico story I wrote last year, we found 3 to 5 year population level differences in life expectancy between the large regions, which may not seem like a lot, but that's comparable to the gap that separates the United States from Bulgaria, Libya, and the Philippines. And these gaps did not go away when we parsed by race, urbanity, impoverishment, education, or county level access to quality health care. These from the Washington Post are FICO credit scores by county. Blue is bad, gold is good. Now there are lots of very rich counties in that blue blob, and a lot of very, very poor ones in the gold one, like the easternmost one in Maine, where I'm from, Washington County, which has the lowest per capita income in the Northeast. Look in at Ohio and look at the differences between Metro Cleveland and the Western Reserve and the South around Cincinnati. Little appreciated is how much the incidence of gun violence, like so many salient issues in American life, varies by region. Here, again, using CDC data, we map the per capita rate for gun deaths by county between 2010 and 2020 inclusive. The Deep South's annual rate of 15.6 per 100,000 residents is about double that of Yankeedom, the New England settled Greater New England zone, and about 4 times that of Dutch-settled New Netherland, Greater New York City, whose rate of 3.8 per 100,000 isn't much higher than Switzerland's, despite being the densest and most diverse part of the entire continent. These gaps, by the way, persist or grow wider if you look at just urban counties compared to each other across the regions, or just rural ones, or just homicides, or just suicides, or just where the victim was white, or just where the victim was black. Not unrelated, here's every fatal white supremacist mob action in the United States between 1835 and 1964, both lynchings and race riots, as mapped by the Monroe Work Today Research Group. The orange dots represent an incident where an African American was killed. The yellow ones are Latino victims. The presence of these regional cultures also profoundly affected 19th century immigration. This, from the Census Bureau, is the percentage of foreign-born people in each county in 1900, in the center of the Great Immigration Wave. Notice that nobody in that wave basically went to the Deep South, Tidewater, or Greater Appalachia, which further reinforced identity and demographic differences between the regions. And this, in turn, affected the distribution of religious traditions. Here, from the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies, U.S. Religion Census, are the dominant religions in each county today. Red is Southern Baptist. There's a green Methodist belt. You can see it going through the Midland Zone. Gray is, of course, LDS, the Mormons. And blue is Catholic, the largest religious group amid the great 1880 to 1924 immigration wave that profoundly changed ideas about American identity, forcing legacy Protestant America to accept that henceforth Catholics, Orthodox Christians and Jews, at least, would be full-fledged Americans too. Except none of that process ever happened in the southern regions. That Baptist zone you see there is a legacy of the spatial maldistribution of the 19th century immigration wave, the only part of the country where Christian nationalism, the notion that America is rightly an evangelical Protestant nation, can find fertile soil, right? Because it's incredibly obvious and has been for 6 generations that that's not true in the other regions. And so my point is that the divides are real, they're persistent, and they matter to life today. Which brings us to the second question issue, our strategic component at Nationhood Lab, which asked and tried to solve the question, well, if that's true, what holds us together? What's ever held us together? Because the regional cultures, the 6 Eastern ones anyway, wound up together in an accident of history. They came together in 1776 to face off a common threat, a change in British imperial policy that threatened to destroy the individual autonomy and way of life of each of their colonial clusters, their political and social systems. And miraculously, when they got together, they won. And they found themselves inside something called the United States of America. But nobody was quite sure what that was supposed to be. The U.S. Federation, in other words, came into being as a contractual agreement, a means to an end for the parties involved. Nobody in the 1770s and 1790s had thought that they had just created a nation state in the sense that Holland or Prussia or post-revolutionary France were. Its people lacked a shared history, religion, or ethnicity. They didn't speak a unique language all their own. They hadn't occupied the continent long enough to have built some sense of dwelling in a mythic homeland since time immemorial, and they killed or pushed out, or were still pushing out, the very people who could make such a claim. They lacked a shared political heritage apart from the imperial ties they had just rebelled against. In short, they had none of the foundations of a nation state. They had no story to bring and hold them together. That story had to be created decades later, starting in the 1830s, really, a story I tell in my most recent book, Union. And the story is the one thing that's held us together, more or less, ever since. But it's been contested from the outset. That story said that, yes, we may lack a shared history, religion, or ethnicity, but what we do share are a set of ideals. The ones in that famous statement in the opening part of the Declaration of Independence, our mission statement as a people, the inherent equality of humans, their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and to access the representative self-government that makes it all possible. To be American, according to this story, was to be committed to this set of propositions about the nature of the universe and people's placement in it. But those ideals were contested by a counter-narrative at the time, in real time, first crafted by a circle of Southern intellectuals who said, no, The Declaration is wrong. Humans are not created equal. In fact, only the Anglo-Saxon race, they argued, had the genius and ability to secure the promises in the Declaration. We're a classical republic, like ancient Greece and Rome, where a minority had the privilege or liberty to practice democracy and subjugation, and slavery were the natural lot of the many. Oh, I think I've changed our slideshow out. Let's recommence. From current slide. There we go. It was an ethno-national and inherently authoritarian vision. Now, the battle between these two visions of America have been our eternal struggle. This was the fight throughout the antebellum period and in the Civil War and Reconstruction. The ethno-nationalists actually ruled this country federation-wide in the 1910s and 20s, when the first deep Southern president, Woodrow Wilson, segregated the federal government. When they were putting up the Confederate statues we've recently been tearing down. When Birth of a Nation was all the rage. A film celebrating the Ku Klux Klan's successful terrorist campaign to restore white supremacy in the occupied South. When the 1924 Immigration Act imposed racial quotas to defend, as it put it, the Anglo-Saxon character of the country. The civic national narrative from the Declaration didn't win the argument and become a federation-wide consensus until the 1960s. And that's when we became what political scientists would call liberal democracy, small l, small d, in the 1960s, not the 1860s. It's in living memory. It's not inevitable. It's an incredible gift that had to be fought for and continues to be fought for, because the forces of autocracy and ethno-nationalism are ascendant. And they have their narrative, their story of the kind of country they're fighting for, all worked out. Make America great again, like it was before that civic national triumph. The rest of us don't have our story worked out. And by the rest of us, I mean the 70 to 80% of Americans who, when disassociated from tribal leanings and partisanship, don't want to live in an authoritarian world. We have the quantitative data, it's very clear. But we've lost that story as Americans, that civic story and message. You know, we were never very good at talking about it, what those civic ideals mean in practice. But after the Cold War, we stopped trying at all as a people. And a vacuum opened up, and demagogues stepped right in, as they always do. We need that story now. And that's the work, the strategic work we're doing at Nationhood Lab, the testing, polling, and crafting of an emotive, effective American story. One that can be used in ordinary conversations, in real-world situations, one that can rally that latent supermajority to defend what should have been America's values for all of the past 249 years. We'll be perfecting that story, a story of pride and reckoning, of an effort to create a society where all people can be meaningfully free. And the new year will be helping to deploy it by putting it in the hands of organizations trying to reform civic education, organizations trying to engage Hollywood producers and showrunners to bring these themes to their creative mix, organizations trying to help business leaders grapple with what values their institutions really can't do without, to political leaders, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, or whatever, as long as they share a commitment to the American experiment, to organizations working to field and protect the vote, like the 700 local chapters of the League of Women Voters, to the 250th anniversary commissions in each of the 50 states, tasked with helping commemorate the anniversary of the country and the Declaration itself a year hence, and in the hands of all of you. We're digesting the results of our polling and qualitative work right now, and we'll be releasing our final messaging product early this winter. Our preliminary national baseline poll, completed in April, was extremely encouraging. We asked registered voters which statements about the nature of the United States they most agreed with. We offered statement pairs about our national purpose, American identity, and the meaning of our past. In each case, one of those statements was keyed off the ideals in the Declaration, the other rooted in more intrinsic characteristics like ancestry, heritage, character, values, history. And the civic ones, to my surprise, proved far more attractive regardless of the gender, age, race, education, or American nation's region of the participant. 63% of Americans preferred the statement that we're united not by a shared religion, ancestry, or history, but by our shared commitment to a set of American founding values. That we all have inherent and equal rights to live, to not be tyrannized, and to pursue happiness as we each understand it, over an alternate one, embraced by only 33% of respondents, that said we're united by shared history, traditions, and values, and by our fortitude and character as Americans, a people who value hard work, individual responsibility, and national loyalty. Now, I put some of the crosstabs up here. I don't know how well you can see them, but green is preference for the civic vision, yellow for the heritage ethno-nationalist constructions. The former, as you can see, was the overwhelming favorite for almost everyone. Again, we were not expecting this, with two major exceptions: Republicans and those who voted for Trump in 2020. But still, in both of those groups, 45% of the respondents in both those segments preferred the Declaration version, joining 63% of independents and 79% of self-identified Democrats. As a starting point, before we even started trying to work any sort of messaging magic, these were very encouraging numbers. In late August, we completed the last rounds of polling, and one of the things we did in that, we decided we'd better test if Americans agree with a sort of central argument we were trying to make from a logic-based interpretation of the Declaration, that we are all duty-bound as Americans to protect one another's rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and etc. We figured it would be, maybe that would be a 60-30 split too. But no, it was 97-2 in favor, which was the largest split our pollster had ever seen in any question they'd ever floated. The other 1% is, don't know, which you often see. So, we'll be deploying that kind of stuff and working in more detail. I'm very excited about what Elizabeth has presented too in civic health metrics. I would love to find ways to see if we can make that scalable, because different regional cultures have different fundamental assumptions. And it's true that a Tocquevillian vision does in fact give you better civic health, but many parts of the country don't have the same traditions and in a sense need remedial assistance, but it has to be from within, not from us Yankees. So I invite you to follow our work as it continues to unfold at Nationhood Lab, and I look forward to this conversation and answering your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Colin, for two really fascinating presentations. I'd like to ask you both to say something about what makes the humanities particularly well suited to sustain democracy and foster civic engagement, and how can we follow the example both of you are setting in terms of breaking down disciplinary boundaries between the humanities and the social sciences in pursuit of those goals.
Well, I can speak from what we do and just the community basis for our work. So the humanities, in distinction from the humanities as they are in departments and disciplines, is more about how people are participating in their communities. So when you think what we do is we support museums and libraries and historical societies and preservation societies and all sorts of other organizations, after school arts organizations, lots of other types of organizations that are really fundamentally, part of their communities, that when people participate in the programs and the projects that are being offered by those places about engaging ways to learn about their past, about having conversations about the issues that affect them now, about connecting historical moments to people's passions and interests in what they want the future to be, that's bringing the humanities fundamentally into civic life, and that, so that's really how humanities are part of civic health and civic life. I think that's not completely recognized as being part of civic life. And so that's in some ways what the work of the Civic Health Index is to show how important that is and to keep going with that. That's what we want to keep going with, is to give organizations the ability to measure how what they do connects to civic health and how the people who participate in their projects and programs understand that, and what impact that has on them, and that by measuring that, even the act of asking those questions is a way to connect people to their desire to be in a civically healthy community. The question about the relationship between the humanities and social sciences feels a little bit separate, but maybe I can let Colin answer the first question.
The macro of the humanities? I mean, I guess, thinking about it at this sort of ordinal perspective, I mean, when we're talking about civic health and preservation of democracy, I mean, those are all the way we order society as humans, power relationships and how we work out to protect people's freedom of movement and all that. It's the humanities are the study of humans, what makes us tick, and the structures and institutions we build. So it's like spot on. There's no other set of sciences that would give you those kind of answers. And people trying to sort of, fly by night without any background in history and sociology and literature and all those other things, they're just flying blind. It's like being a surgeon and not having gone to medical school. You could do it, but it's not a great idea. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we're entering this crisis after a generation in which civic education was no longer taught in most schools, right? And where the humanities have been derided, right? It's all STEM. Yeah, STEM's great. Engineering and math are awesome. But you don't take them and then eliminate people's understanding of history and society. And we're never very good at teaching history, but the fact that we've eliminated all those things, and then finally to really do us in, the generation that fought World War II and the fascists and saw the Holocaust is now passed from the scene. And you're seeing the rise of the right in Europe, too, the same is true. I mean, all of these things, if you don't reiterate and understand the lessons of the past, you're in trouble. Who are the most powerful people in our society today? The billionaire tech bros who have a STEM-only education, right? And that doesn't give you the understanding of the implications of changes in social systems or the past and how institutions function for good or bad. So that's not very helpful, particularly if they start entering the, government reform business with no background in that either.
So I'll just say a little bit about the humanities and social sciences. I think one of the things that was very meaningful and powerful for us as an organization in undertaking the Civic Health Index is that we knew as an organization that we were not skilled, that we were not trained, we were not, we did not have the background in terms of data analysis and doing a survey and understanding the ways how of thinking through all the different data sets that we were working with. So being able to work with social scientists that were very skilled at doing population surveys and things like that, and also working with public health people, the people who are doing the Rhode Island Life Index, was also really was incredibly helpful. We couldn't have done it without that. I think what was also interesting about it is that the people that we worked with also really understood what we were trying to do was not what they would necessarily have done. So we were asking questions about not simply how people participate in civic institutions, but what their experiences of their neighborhoods are, of how they understand history and the differences across different populations in that, which were profound. That I think was very the social sciences that we worked with really found that very meaningful, and that potentially that's influencing the social scientific work that's proceeding as well. So I think there was a lot of cross pollination and learning from both.
I'm sorry, what was the second prompt?
The second question was about how we can do a better job of breaking down disciplinary boundaries between the humanities and social sciences in the interest of creating a more vibrant and unified civic culture.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we should, and to the extent this is a question for the academy, I mean, just the fact that we're cross-pollinating right now across and up and down the bay is terrific. I've tried to use a network model. I'm at an academic think tank, but not in a department, so I have the freedom of movement to do exactly that. We've been trying to network with other institutions and disciplines to do exactly that. So more of that, please. There are institutional constraints, especially in the academy, where everyone's got your departmental responsibilities and your incentive structures and what you're rewarded for aren't necessarily that, but obviously we all need that as much as we can, and I welcome all those connections. I mean, I've had this year, using American Nations, we've published 20 peer-reviewed academic journal articles. I'm a guy with a history degree and master's in international relations, and I'm a fellow in a geographical society. They're all in medical and cardiology and public health journals. I'm the caboose author on it, but that's a collaboration I'm doing with people who work in public health and medicine and dentists and physiologists, looking at how American Nations affects things like obesity and diabetes that you saw from that, and how it interrelates with social and civic functions. How does your society or environment, what are the policy choices? What's the infrastructure like or not like? Are there correlations between those things and the patterns we see? Do they match the regional cultures and the deep heritages and different ideas about how you balance those interests? Yes, more so than you would think. But that's an example of an interdisciplinary thing that's taking fields that don't go together to get wider use. So I think everyone's getting used to nowadays, with the internet and remote meeting and the networked nature of life. I think it's getting easier and easier for people to start cross-pollinating like that, but we all have to make a sort of special effort to do it.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to the audience. But your last comments, Colin, were a nice segue to a question I wanted to ask, which is that both of your work has demonstrated really interesting connections between civic and physical health. And I wondered if you could say more about how civic engagement can foster physical health, and are there opportunities to enlist partners in the healthcare community around that goal?
Yeah, it's such an important question to ask, and I would just mention the revolutionary flag, join or die, and which is also the title of a recent documentary about the impact of Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, which is also titled Join or Die, and I mean that it's essentially that participation in civic life is correlates to physical health, and Colin really mapped that out and in his presentation, but that's what the correlation is, but in terms of where there has been a lot of interest in the Civic Health Index from public health advocates. So the health equity zones, there's several health equity zones in Rhode Island, and two of the health equity zones reached out to us about the Civic Health Index to learn more about it, and would really like to connect more about this relationship between participation in cultural participation and what contributes to public health. So there's a lot of potential there, and in many ways it's what public health is all about. It's about what people do in their daily lives that contributes to their health. or not?
Yeah, there's absolutely a relationship in both directions. One of those papers that we did, lead authors, my collaborators, Ross Arena at the University of Illinois Chicago and Nico Pronk at the Health Partners Institute in Minnesota, asked the question, what are the correlations between health and voting, right, as an expression of civic participation? And the correlations were crazily tight. I mean, places where people are healthy have excellent voter turnout, in places where they don't. And starting to link, the opposite is absolutely true as well. I mean, culture begats ideology, begats your policy environment, and creates the social determinants of health. And we're seeing throughout all these papers we're doing and building up the evidence and the foundations that the interrelationship between whether or not your society or area or county or regional culture favors actually investing in the infrastructure of society, whether it's your health system or pre-Ks or libraries or recreational facilities where you can actually go out and do activities and stuff, that the relationship between that communitarian model of how you organize society and health outcomes is total. I mean, the correlations are crazy when you do a Pearson correlation on it between those at a county level and a regional culture level, and we see that from all sorts of indices. So life expectancy is lower in places with the individualism. No taxes. Less regulation will make you more free, but it makes you die earlier. It makes you sick. The polling, like, are you happy, right? The happiness index. It asks people, hey, how's your life going? What's your self evaluated feeling about how your life's doing? Terrible in all the individual liberty zones. Much better in all the communitarian ones. In every single thing we've looked at, it's the same pattern, except binge drinking, by the way. In binge drinking, the communitarian places are terrible, and the individual liberty ones are great. You see it in Europe, too, right? Suddenly, Finland is, the most happy place, and Iceland, and they do great, and they're binge drinking like crazy, and Italy and Greece, the economy's collapsing, and there's no binge drinking, but I don't know, communitarianism makes you binge drink, I guess. We'll have to delve into that more. But, yeah, absolute relationships between those two things, and my partners who are driving that research agenda are focused very much on exactly that interrelationship.
That is really interesting. Thank you, Colin and Elizabeth. Do we have questions from the audience? I'll come around with the microphone so people can hear you on the live stream.
Very compelling cases made for different subcultures that define this country. Given the long history of this, it's a two-part question, really. Given the long history of this, can you really ultimately expect a common narrative to emerge, or will it eventually end up in regional kinds of things? And the part two is, are there differences between the regions in how they respond to polls? Are some regions people, I don't want to hear about polls, other people, yeah.
I don't know that I have numbers to answer the polling question. In what we did, we didn't notice in our own polling any big differences between regional response rates or patterns that seem strange. I think, in general, if you're asking people about politics, like, are you going to vote for, Trump or Harris, that's where people are more reticent. But if you're asking them, hey, what do you think of the civic ideals of the country? How's your life going? Do you think that humans have a inherent right to the pursuit of happiness? Those kind of questions people don't have any incentive on either side to shut down or weed out in the same sort of way. So I don't think so, but it probably depends on what kind of questions you're actually polling and surveying. As to the other question, that's the great challenge, right? The reason that our country is unstable and had a civil war and is prone to fracturing and lacks a consensus and has had dysfunctional politics fairly continuously since about 1996 is in fact rooted in the fact that we're this awkward balkanized federation. But at the same time, this awkward balkanized federation rose to be the, superpower of the world that many countries and people look upon, sometimes in anger, but always the civic national thing that we're supposed to be doing, right? Trying to create a society where humans can be sustainably and meaningfully free. And that was a genuinely revolutionary idea when it kind of popped out. Everyone ignored the Declaration for like 40 years. But once people started looking at it, like, oh, that's a pretty fascinating set of ideas, and it changed the world, and it built a country that, by many metrics was very successful. How did we do it? Well, we glossed over and didn't look at things like the fact that there was a authoritarian one-party state with a formalized racial apartheid system in half, a third of the country, right? We just kind of overlooked those things until the Cold War forced us to do otherwise. But nowadays, with technology, everywhere is in your face at all times. You know what's going on. You can't say one thing to one audience in one place and another to an audience somewhere else. We're all living in, the country has matured and the spaces in between have closed. So all of those rough edges and overlooked things in our national story are much harder to just kind of ignore and gloss over. Now, that's not just happening with us, that's happening with nations everywhere, especially ones that have a complex structure, be it Belgium or Canada or even Russia. These are all questions that we're all facing in this new environment. So I think that we have our track record shows that it's possible to do it. I think the strength of those ideals, the civic ideals of the Declaration, are excellent ideals, right? These are the ideals that Frederick Douglass was arguing for in every single speech he made. He's like, hey, these are great ideals. You white Northerners ought to try them, right? That was his argument. It's Lincoln at Gettysburg. It's Martin Luther King at the Mall. I mean, these are the rousing American experiment, American promise ideas, and there's a reason that they've transmitted and inspired people across the world and reshaped the world. But they're ideals that we've never fully implemented and often betrayed, but those should be the North Star. If you get that North Star out there again, I think you can pull the regional cultures together. I mean, Deep South does not have a civic national tradition that goes deep, and many Deep Southerners know that. I mean, the heroic fight to change the Deep South in that respect is something that you should be backing everyone who's trying to do that. But all the other regional cultures, in the end, are all dedicated to that premise. It's just they take very different ideas about how you best get there. So opening the conversation and figuring out where the common guardrails are is the important initial step to actually having a conversation where you can start sorting and debating those things in a constructive way towards getting to where we want to go, right? Creating a society where people can be sustainably and meaningfully free as individuals.
I think one of the values in that, one of the things about that question of a common narrative is that who feels that they possess that, what they consider to be a common narrative, and who doesn't feel that they, or even wants to be part of a common narrative. So one of the questions that is a kind of a precursor to your question is one that we asked in the Rhode Island Civic Health Survey, and it was really just a very simple question about do you feel that you understand Rhode Island history prior to colonization to the present? And it wasn't about if they actually do understand, but how they feel about that. And overwhelmingly, older white respondents felt that they do understand that. And younger respondents did not, nor did many, a large percentage of the non-white respondents felt that they did not understand it, meaning that they did not feel that they possessed that narrative. So I think one of the things that has to happen is that you just have to hold up that mirror and say, this is where we are. And I think just doing that helps to understand sort of what would be the value of having a common narrative and what are other approaches to that.
Thank you for your presentation today. The young audience here appreciates it very much. In being a young audience between probably the ages of 40 and 100, I'm wondering, the work you're doing now is new. I mean, in 2020 to 2024, a lot of the statistics you show here are, new and burgeoning, and you're collecting it all together. And I guess my question is, in a roundabout way, is a question of information. We get besieged with information every single day. I'm not sure that it's good information, bad information, misinformation, disinformation, whatever. And it's very hard, I think, to process all that through and to wonder what is right and what is wrong, because that's another whole parallel conversation too. I'm just wondering, your work, which is just beginning now, will it continue, and where do you hope it goes?
You want to start? Yeah.
Sure. So this question of information, good, bad, indifferent, the volume of it, all of those things was part of the Civic Health Index, in the sense that we were really interested in the work of the Media Education Lab and the survey that they had just completed on media literacy, which is very analogous to the question of information versus knowledge. How do you sort out what's truth and non-truth, all of those things, and how is that part of just how you confront all this huge barrage and volume of information. And I think it's important, just in terms of like holding up the mirror again, this was a survey of schools, of teachers and parents. It's very, media literacy education in schools is very uneven. And there are some places that are where it's part of the curriculum and what young people are learning, and then many places where that's not happening at all. And that this is something that's really fundamental to being a participant in civic life, but yet we're not investing in that. And so that's, I think, important. I think it's really important to recognize that there's not a singular experience, but that also needs to be part of our systems, our education systems, and that it's not happening in a consistent way.
I think, you've hit on one of the biggest challenges we're all facing is the collapse of the information space, right? Not only are people now clustered into their own information bubbles, but now, and being fed algorithmically whatever a client wants to feed them individually, and that's often the only place they're getting their information. But even that system is now kind of collapsed, like the entire information system. There is no way you could put out a story that's important in the New York Times and the Washington Post and all the networks simultaneously, even Fox, and you probably wouldn't reach, 60% of voters. It's a total collapse, and it's affecting all sorts of countries. You can see like all the surveys of trust in various institutions, government, churches, journalism, universities, whatever it is. You can see this inflection point all at the same moment. I think it's like in 2010 or something, or 2008 or something like that. But the moment is the moment that the iPhone was launched, right? It's sort of the coincidence. And I think that's true. We all dove into those spaces, and the pandemic forced us all into this digital space that we haven't all crawled out of, even to a degree we don't understand. And that's terrible, because if you don't have truth and facts, you can't run a democratic system of government, and we don't have that right now. So what do you have to do? We got to relearn how to do all that stuff, right? There's the dark arts of the internet, and people who are trying to promote the truth and good stuff are going to have to access those dark arts. And by that I mean I'm from legacy media, right? I believed after I was, Eastern Europe and the Balkans, that actually covering things, hopefully in prestigious papers where it's believed, that you would then be able to inform people the truth of things, then people would make the right decisions. I've kind of left journalism because our ability to do that, I can just see the collapse of your ability to reach an audience with facts, because the lies can just race out there. People can make up anything they want. It goes viral instantly. But in that is the proof of concept, right? The craziest things out there. There's a staggering number of Americans, I can't remember what it is, 25, 30% or something, who believe the QAnon conspiracy. This is literally a conspiracy that Democrats are involved in a pedophilic sacrifices in a satanic cult based in the basement of a basementless pizza restaurant in Washington D.C. I mean, it's totally nuts, but huge numbers of people believe that, and all kinds of other completely whacked out things. But the fact that can be generated intentionally, you can convince a huge number of people not to protect themselves from a deadly contagious disease with a free vaccine shot, but instead to take horse dewormers. I mean, some troll farm in Macedonia, somebody's high-five, hey, you did it, yeah, you only got to have to buy you pizza. It's the fact, though, that can be done as proof of concept that in the dark arts of the universe, huge numbers of people can be shifted to believe almost anything. So the good side of the force, the rest of us are going to have to get down from our high horse and figure out and collaborate with people who know how this new information ecosystem works and, get the truth out through those mechanisms. Now, I don't know how to do that because, my idea of a great journalism or reaching out to the public is to write an Atlantic essay, right? But that's not doing it. So my project is trying to generate the message, the software, and we tried to find, or hopefully it gets picked up by partners who know how to do that stuff, who are TikTok producers and social media people who understand how all that stuff works. But it's going to be essential because that's now where the audience is. They're not only not in front of the nightly news, but they're not reading any standard media that we would recognize as journalism reliably.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Colin and Elizabeth, for sharing the important work you're doing and for really stimulating discussion. I hope you all will linger, have a cookie, some coffee, chat with our panelists. Our Sustaining Democracy series continues next semester with 4 more events, and our next one is, I believe, February 19th with a talk by Eric Gottesman about the arts and democracy. So stay tuned. We're putting together our website for next semester's events. I hope you'll come back. And thank you again for coming out tonight.